Welcome to Pullback, the podcast where we usually try something new in ethical consumption. I'm Kristen, and this episode I'm joined by Michelle Desilets, the Executive Director of the Orangutan Land Trust. Michelle and I have a conversation where we talk about her work with orangutan conservation, the threats that orangutans face, and crucially connected to that, the Orangutan Land Trust's approach to addressing sustainable palm oil. We hope that you'll enjoy the episode. I think it was a pretty good conversation, so here we go. Hi, Michelle. I'm wondering if we could maybe start by getting you to explain a little bit about your own personal journey. So how is it that you got involved with orangutan conservation?
Well, I've been fascinated by the primate world since I was a small child. And in university, I dreamed of being like Diane Fossey or Jane Goodall and looking after great apes in the wild. And as a child, I was really fascinated with the primate world. My favorite book was Curious George when I was quite small. And I was determined that someday in my life, I would be looking after monkeys or apes. And I followed the work of leaders in that field, such as Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, Bruce Galdicus, whose pioneering studies of the great apes really set in motion the need for conservation. I tried to pursue such a career academically, but was quite soon dissuaded by my professors that I would ever get a job in the field. So I ended up becoming a school teacher instead. But my passion for the great apes persisted, and I would spend my summer vacation time traveling to places like South America and Africa and Southeast Asia to go and see these species in the wild. And it was when I went to Southeast Asia for the first time, and I volunteered to help in following the great apes, following the orangutans in the field and learning more about them. And I met a small little orphaned orangutan that was being held in a tiny cage behind a ranger's hut in the national park. And he just stole my heart. His name was Smalia, and my life was never the same after that. And eventually I met I kept going back to this project and volunteering and looking after orphan baby orangutans, which, I thought there's nothing better in life than to be surrounded by these delightful animals. But the conditions at the project that we were working at were not very good. And I met there a lady called Lone Droscher Nielsen, a Danish woman who has since been made famous for her work in orangutan conservation. You might have seen her on Orangutan Island or Orangutan Diary or any number of programs that aired globally about her work. And she and I had this crazy idea. She was volunteering at the same time, that we could go off and set up our own rescue and rehabilitation center for orangutans and do it better. And in 1998, I started out doing this in 94. In 1998, we did just that. We found the funds, we found the support, we got the memorandum of understanding with the Indonesian government, and we developed what became the world's largest primate rescue project, the Nyarmenting Orangutan Rehabilitation Project, operated by the Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation. And so that's where my passion, really, came to fruition. And of course, we needed to find the funds to keep this organization or this project going. By that time, I had moved to the United Kingdom to settle, and I created the Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation UK branch to support these efforts. So those are my early days in orangutan conservation. It was later, around 2003, 2004, when I came to understand that orangutan conservation was about much more than picking up the pieces and rescuing orphaned orangutans, and that we needed to look at a more holistic strategy for protecting the species. And by 2009, I had opened the Orangutan Land Trust to focus on those issues.
So I'm wondering if you could maybe tell the listeners, You said the sort of orangutans stole your heart. What's so wonderful about the species?
Where do I begin? First of all, there's nothing cuter on this planet than a baby orangutan. And that's, a great part of their predicament. They're too cute for their own good. And in those early days, most of the orangutans that were being rescued were actually confiscations, where these orangutans were being made orphaned. Their mothers were being killed, and they were being trafficked internationally or locally, kept as pets, or perhaps sold on to zoos, that less than reputable zoos and tourist facilities, where they would dress them up to fight as Thai kickboxers or something stupid like this. So when they come to our center in the old days, I just say, because it's not my center at this time, it belongs to the Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation, we would have to become like surrogate mothers to them. And we would learn all of their idiosyncrasies and their distinct personalities. And they, as a school teacher, I found them as distinct and as delightful and charming and lovable as the diversity of pupils that I had in my classroom, each with their different personalities. And they're quick and clever and mischievous, and they have the most amazing sense of humor.
Really? They have a sense of humor? That's great.
Oh, yeah. They like to play tricks on you or on one another, and or play chase or any. They're the masters of their own diversion. You just see them, you stand back from them if they're in their forest playground, and just watch them get up to their antics, and don't disturb them. Don't try not to engage with them, and let them do what they will do naturally. And as youngsters, they're just a laugh a minute of what they get up to. I don't want to make them into caricatures or cartoon figures, but they are amusing. And again, that's part of the problem, that this makes them desirable for people to have as pets, the thing that, two things that most, keep me most connected with the orangutan and make me cherish them most is their capacity for forgiveness. Because these animals have been through the most awful situations, seeing their mothers killed before their eyes, or being, kept in deplorable conditions, or hurt themselves. And yet, in very little time, with the right love and attention and nurturing from their caretakers, they forgive. I know they don't forget, because they have nightmares in the night, and you can only presume they're dreaming of what they remember. But they tend to forgive and move on and embrace love again. And the other thing is their resiliency. So that ties in with it. They've gone through all of this, and every now and then, yes, you'll have an orangutan that just can't recover from the emotional trauma, and they will just perish. They'll just slowly or quickly decide not to eat, and not respond to treatment, and literally die of a broken heart or die of the trauma that they've gone through. But most of these animals are so resilient, and they bounce back, and again, with that humor and that love, that it's like, how can you be so happy now? How can you be such a wonderful, delightful individual after all you've gone through? And I think that has been the most endearing quality of the orangutan.
Wow, that sounds like just really rewarding work and really interesting experience. I'm curious, because you had mentioned starting from conservation projects and then realizing that there were sort of bigger challenges that needed to be addressed if orangutan conservation was really going to be something that worked. So maybe could you talk to me about the major threats that orangutans face?
Yes, of course. The major threats, as I said, originally back in the 90s and early 2000s, it was the capture and trade of these animals, removing them from the wild for these reasons. But in around 2003, that's when the oil palm plantations started really taking hold in the region that we were working in, Central Kalimantan in Borneo in Indonesia. And suddenly we moved from these confiscations and picking up generally relatively healthy orangutans for the most part, to sending out rescue teams in the middle of the night to rush to locations several hours drive away, on word of an orangutan in trouble in the new clearings of forest for the expanding oil palm. And these animals were found brutally attacked and massacred. Because the orangutans were known to venture into these newly planted areas and perhaps destroy some of the young trees that had just been planted, the plantation managers would see them as an agricultural pest that needed to be eradicated. And indeed, some plantation managers put bounties on the heads of these orangutans. They would pay a local worker or a villager 10 or 20 US dollars, literally, to present the head of an orangutan. And so, yes, but the people didn't have, shotguns that they could cleanly, they would take anything to hand,
right,
to take down an orangutan. And it's not easy to take down a full-grown orangutan. So the rescuers would find these poor souls, beaten unconscious or to death with wooden planks or iron bars, or tied up in netting and wires, or hacked to death with machetes, maybe shot with air gun pellets. A lot of cases that continue. Orangutans being found with 50 or 100 air gun pellets lodged in their bodies, and yet they survive, oftentimes with these horrific injuries. And the worst case I saw was when they doused the orangutan in gasoline and set them alight.
Oh my gosh.
And the lucky ones who survived were brought back to the center, or if they were quite healthy, they could be translocated immediately into a safe patch of forest. But hundreds started coming into the rescue center that needed intensive care, round the clock treatment to keep them alive, and then ultimately to help them thrive and have an opportunity to return to the wild one day. So not only were we faced with this flood of victims coming in faster than we could put up cages, quite literally, we had some orangutans coming in while the boys were still putting the roofs on their enclosures. But then the outlet wasn't there. There was no solution. There are limited places where you could put these orangutans safely and know that that forest wasn't going to be knocked down next year or in 2 years' time. So the challenge was to find areas that they could be safely released for the long term, but equally, or perhaps more importantly, stop this flood of victims. And that meant looking at what was driving their displacement and the killing on the ground. And that was the displacement, the clearing of their habitat. These orangutans wouldn't find themselves in these areas and getting into trouble if their habitat was being cleared. So that's where we said, look, we need to look at this palm oil issue. We need to see what opportunities do we have to intercede into this juggernaut of destruction and change the trajectory for the future of orangutans.
Yeah. So I think this is maybe a good time to start talking about the Orangutan Land Trust. So could you maybe tell me a little bit about your organization and what it does?
Our objective is to enable sustainable solutions for the long-term survival of the orangutan. So what that means is to look for those solutions that keep orangutans alive where they are found. And in fact, most orangutans are found outside of protected areas. And in Borneo alone, over 10,000 orangutans live in areas allocated for industrial palm. We can't rescue, put in facilities, translocate tens of thousands of orangutans. This is not a solution. It might be a solution on a one-off, a case-by-case basis where the orangutan is in such a position that it will die if you don't immediately remove it from the area, and that becomes more a welfare issue rather than conservation issue. So we work with stakeholders from government to growers of oil palm to communities and local people to the NGOs to the consumers and the manufacturers and retailers to try to find these solutions for where the orangutan lives. And then also to support those activities that are giving an outlet for the orangutans that do need to be moved or have been moved. So that might mean supporting securing an area of forest in which to release orangutans, supporting the restoration after the fires which burn year after year in their habitat to provide better habitat for the orangutans, sufficient fruiting trees to enable them to thrive, corridors to allow them to move freely and find mates and find food. So these are the areas. A lot of that means it means I don't spend any more time playing with small orangutans. That delightful and quite necessary work is left to the very capable hands of the local Indonesians who take this on. So my work has shifted from those delightful days in the forest in a hammock to sitting in conference rooms in Singapore, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, New York, or London, with decision makers and supply chain members of the palm oil or timber or pulp paper supply chain, and working to deliver these solutions. So it's a lot less sexy than it used to be, but nonetheless, really, really important work that I think we do.
Yeah, for sure. So when it comes to the issue of palm oil, what is the Orangutan Land Trust's general approach? What would you like to see?
Well, the approach is knowing that conventional palm oil has proved to be a major threat to the survival of the orangutan and its rainforest habitat and all the biodiversity that it shares in those rainforests. Our goal is to see that sustainable palm oil becomes the norm, that the standard for sustainable palm oil is rigorous, but more than that, that it's implemented and delivering tangible, positive impacts on the ground. So we're not concerned, well, we are concerned, but our main concern is not a piece of paper that says Company X has a target for sustainable palm oil, either production or sourcing by such year. Yes, that's all part of the transition. But more importantly is, what does that mean? Is this company supporting smallholders on the ground so they can be part of the solution? Because remember, smallholders, or maybe you don't know, but smallholders, or your listeners may not know, smallholders represent 40% of global production of palm oil. They've got to be included the transition to sustainable practices if we're really to address the impacts on biodiversity. And so all of us play a part in supporting that. So yes, our position is that all stakeholders must play their part. They have a shared responsibility in seeing that palm oil is produced sustainably. And that means no deforestation, no peat clearance, and no human exploitation in this most basic of terms. Of course, it's much more detailed than that. All the principles and criteria set out by the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. To see that delivered, we need everyone from the consumer, manufacturers, retailers, play their part and make the distinction between sustainable and conventional palm oil and make the choice for sustainable palm oil. Reward those companies that are doing the right thing, provide the incentive for the companies that are unsure, not quite there, to make the move towards sustainable production. And only then can we see the rates of deforestation. We are starting to see the rates of deforestation decline in places like Indonesia. And the science demonstrates that part of that is attributable to transition to sustainable agriculture. So that is our focus.
Well, it's good to hear that there's some progress being made, because it seems like a very difficult challenge. I'm curious about, so your organization works with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And I'm curious if you could tell me a bit more about how you're involved and why you've taken the approach of being involved with that organization.
I think to address this issue, you need to have players that are working within. You need to be working alongside the industry and the stakeholders, but you also need the ones on the outside. So we cherish the work that non-RSPO NGOs do in calling to task the shortcomings of RSPO or its members, or where a company is not compliant with the standard. Their eyes and ears are critical to what we call continuous improvement. That's not to say that the RSPO doesn't have its own duty of care to, be sure that everything's in order anyway, and they shouldn't be relying on these NGOs. But it's all part of the story. So we think that working from within is our best strategy. And we joined as Borneo Orangutan Survival very early days of the RSPO. And we have participated in the review of the principles and criteria, those rules that illustrate what sustainable palm oil should look like both in 2013 and in 2018. And we've introduced new criteria in both cases. In 2013, we introduced what could be loosely called the no-kill, zero tolerance policy, which means RSPO members must not capture, harm, kill any rare, threatened, or endangered species. They must have programs to educate their entire workforce in this, and strong policy on sanctions should should employee be found culpable of such a thing, that they don't just pass it on to the local police to deal with, that they take actions within their company to deal with this. And in 2018, we worked really, really hard to make sure that there was a strong element of, a strong standard for true no deforestation. And they're not something that was vague, like, oh, well, if they're really big trees, don't cut them down. No, I had to do the proper no deforestation clause. We've also participated in advisory task force and setting out the new plantings procedure guidelines, which basically tells you what to do or not to do, where to go and not to go when you're expanding or creating a new plantation. We sit on the complaints panel, so we deal with the rogues and laggards that aren't pulling their weight, and help to deliberate what sanctions they will get. And keep the membership in line in that sense. The No Deforestation Task Force, the High Conservation Value and Biodiversity Working Group, the Outreach Working Group. There's so many like cogs and wheels and everything going on behind the scenes to really deliver the impacts behind the aspiration of the standard. So RSPO is not just somebody who slaps a certificate on a company and has some paperwork behind it or something like this. It's really about working with experts, scientists, civil society, and so forth, to really tease out the methods and strategies that are going to really deliver on this. So we do that. We also are active in the Palm Oil Innovation Group, which builds upon the standards set out by the RSPO and works on innovations in which to implement the standard. We are a participant in the Sustainable Palm Oil Choice platform here in EU and UK to drive 100% certified sustainable palm oil uptake across the EU in 2020. And we also initiated what's called the PONGO Alliance. That stands for the Palm Oil and NGO Alliance, which brings together some of the largest players in the palm oil industry, the largest growers, as well as NGOs and scientists, to deliver solutions for allowing resilient landscapes where wildlife and people can coexist.
Oh, that's a lot of things. But yeah, you're right. I think something that consumers often don't realize and can't, because there's so many initiatives going on, is just how complicated each of these standards are, behind the scenes. So it's nice to hear some detail from you about how that kind of thing works. I was curious because part of your role is in sort of advancing uptake of sustainable palm oil. Could you maybe talk about where you think we're at as sort of a globe on sustainable palm oil and what the future might look like?
Okay. I don't have like a lot of precise data and at my fingertips as far as numbers. I don't retain those very good. I need spreadsheets in front of me to do that. But I can tell you that here in the UK, we're quite progressive. At last count, 79% of the palm oil that was coming into the UK was certified, and we
Wow.
expect that number in a couple of months. There should be another updated number, and that obviously shall go up. And across the EU, I think we're about that range, maybe just slightly lower. There's a commitment called the Amsterdam Declaration Partnership for Forests, which is a number of European countries that have signed on to declare their ambition to achieve 100% deforestation-free commodities in 2020. So the pressure's on to get us there. In USA, I'm sorry, I don't have the figures. Consumption in USA is less than it is across the EU. In fact, the leading consuming countries for palm oil are China, India, Indonesia itself, its domestic consumption, Pakistan, the EU, and lower down, USA, North America, Australia, New Zealand. But all these markets play a part. So, for example, the sensitive markets like Europe or America, where there's some understanding of sustainable procurement and that consumers are expecting their companies to not be delivering products that support human trafficking or child labor or deforestation, that you have these multinational companies, manufacturers, often based in these regions, but delivering globally and sourcing globally. And so the communications from consumers, consumer action groups, NGOs in these regions propels those companies to make their commitment. And then they go to their suppliers and say, look, our global commitment is sustainable. And so it's that trajectory that moves the needle, really. Sadly, at this point, only about 20% of the sustainable palm oil that's being produced, is sustainable. And that has not moved very much in recent years because, one, the companies who've made these commitments aren't following through. Some have made commitments saying we're going to be deforestation free by 2020, and they're not going to hit their target. And others are making new claims saying, yeah, we'll be deforestation free by 2023 or 2025. They keep moving the goalposts. And this isn't good enough. And so we need to really demand that these companies follow through on that. The sustainable palm oil is out there for them to buy. There is no excuse. Well, I'm sure they can find an excuse, but morally, there's no excuse for them not to be picking that up. And in fact, of that palm oil that is produced sustainably, only about half of it is being bought as sustainable. That is to say, is only being paid the premium due to sustainable suppliers.
Is that because there aren't enough buyers for sustainable palm oil right now, or?
Yeah, Company X says, well, yeah, I like your palm oil, but I don't care if it's sustainable or not. I'll just pay you the going rate for conventional palm oil. Do you want to sell it or not? And yeah, if there aren't the other companies that are actually picking up this sustainable palm oil and paying the premium, then they're not going to let it, sit in vats and rot. They're going to sell it, right? So it's all being moved. All that sustainable palm oil is being moved, but it's not being recognized as sustainable. And if you don't recognize it, then what incentive is there for them to remain sustainable, let alone what incentive is there of any onlooking company to pursue the cost and efforts and resources that it takes to become sustainable? There has to be, a business case for sustainability. And unless we demand it as consumers, and unless the manufacturers and retailers follow through on sustainable sourcing, then these numbers aren't going to shift.
So I'm curious about whether you have any advice for consumers that might be concerned about this issue, but not sure how to approach sustainable palm oil.
It's such a complex issue, and it's a big ask for a consumer to be, become deeply informed and up to date on all of this. It's, I've been working on it for 15 years and I'm still learning every day. The first thing I would say is to move away from the mindset that saving orangutans is as easy as saying no to palm oil. How I wish that were true. I'd be singing it from the mountaintops if it were. I'd be like, great, silver bullet solution. Let's all, if you look at the science, you look at the figures, you look at the reality of global trade and agriculture and rising demand for oilseed growth, that's not going to really deliver any positive benefit on the ground. I could talk for eons about this. It could prove disastrously counterproductive if companies globally switch to alternatives which are more land hungry, and those land hungry crops are pursued in the tropics, thereby putting more pressure on biodiversity and forests. It doesn't bear thinking about. So please move away from what might be well-intentioned but intellectually lazy to say, if I just boycott palm oil, deforestation will stop. Then the next step is to understand that there's a difference between conventional palm oil, business as usual, and sustainable palm oil, and to choose the sustainable palm oil. Now, choosing might mean buying the product that has it, but that's very hard to do. I can talk about that in a second. More importantly, I think, is communicating to the brands and retailers that you expect no less than sustainable ingredients in the products you buy and consume. To say, I really like this chocolate bar. Quick tweet to the chocolate bar company: are you using palm oil? Is it sustainable? I really care about orangutans. These guys, keep that communication going. Let the companies know that this matters to you. Okay, the buying power, you can say, buying power has its place, but remember, palm oil is a kind of a hidden ingredient. It might be a fraction of a % of your end product. So buying the product may or may not get the message to the sustainability team. It might give it to the marketing team that they're doing a good job, kind of thing. So as much as putting your money where your mouth is, it's the communication. Now, there are some tools. In North America, the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo has an excellent app that allows you to scan a product and get an idea where they are in their journey towards sourcing sustainable palm oil. The WWF published a few months ago a palm oil scorecard with many of your favorite brands and retailers represented on it. And it gives a quite detailed look at what they're doing, not only as far as sourcing sustainably and removing deforestation from their palm oil supply chains, but maybe if they're supporting conservation on the ground or supporting smallholders, the overarching efforts towards really delivering tangible outcomes. And that should be updated before the end of the year. And the companies that scored low or medium in the first round of this year, we're really, hoping that consumers will push them to improve their scores. Demonstrate that there's, really buying certified sustainable palm oil, increase their volumes, support conservation on the ground, these kinds of things. So those are two ready tools that the consumer in North America can use. And there's similar tools here in the UK. And finally, I suppose if you're interested in this issue, follow some of the NGOs that are working on this issue. Again, whether they're on the outside or on the inside. So there's a lot of orangutan organizations like Sumatran Orangutan Society, Orangutan Republic, Borneo Orangutan Survival, Orangutan Land Trust, all active in the sustainable palm oil field, members of RSPO. They have information and can keep you up to date. But also the more critical NGOs on the outside, they can say, you know what, look, your favorite chocolate bar is just not doing its bit. Here's a petition. We really need to kick their butt. And I would, if the petition is really well made and delivered to the right people, it really can make a difference. We've seen it happen.
Okay. So sign petitions and be vocal with the brands that you like. Those are sort of two big approaches, and then look for RSPO certified where you can.
Unfortunately, the trademark doesn't appear very much on packaging. Real estate on a package is like really prime, and the brands and retailers like, no, I can't use that space for another logo or label, or it's something that a lot of people don't understand or maybe get the wrong impression. Oh, palm oil, bad. Oh, put it back. No, it's sustainable. Really, it opens up a Pandora's box, or a bit of confusion there sometimes. So the confusion behind the meaning of the trademark, the lack of understanding of it, the space on the package. These are all reasons why a company that is using sustainable palm oil may not put it on pack. And that's why I say, maybe we need to look towards social media to get those answers, or these various scorecards or apps that can give us an idea who's on the right track and who do we need to avoid or nudge.
Yeah, I'm curious about, is it your impression that when people reach out and ask questions to companies about sustainable palm oil, is that something that genuinely figures into their calculus later with palm oil?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we work, behind the scenes. We have, private meetings with such companies, and they say, look, we're getting more and more messages like this. We're ready to move towards this. We don't want the such and such message. They struggle because there's a disconnect between the people who don't quite understand this issue, saying, when are you going to remove your palm oil, to the knowledge that the NGOs and experts are actually saying, well, actually you should be moving towards sustainable palm oil. And how do they communicate that to the wider consumer? So this remains a bit of a challenge, but they're getting more messages saying that people, want to be assured that the product isn't contributing to these problems. And then it's a matter of communicating that sustainable supply chains is a way to ensure that. So yes, it is working. It is making a difference.
That's great. That's a really tangible thing people can do, I think. So,
and like I said, let's say it's a big multinational company. They're a member of RSPO. People in North America, let's say they have a big market in North America, are saying, look, we expect you to be sustainable. Well, that company has to make a commitment with RSPO to be 100% sustainable wherever they're selling, in a certain time frame that they designate. So where India and China doesn't have the large numbers of people calling for sustainable products, they're still going to get it if that company makes that commitment, that change. So that's where the consumer pressure power is really having this global effect. It's not just the chocolate that's in your chocolate bar. It's the chocolate that's in, not the chocolate, the palm oil that's in your, well, you should be doing this for chocolate and tea and coffee and rubber and vanilla and everything else too. The whole story of sustainable palm oil goes across all commodities, really. But as we're talking about palm oil, when you're demanding the sustainable palm oil in your chocolate bar, ultimately that should deliver sustainable palm oil in the chocolate bar of the young person in India or China.
So I'm curious as well. You had mentioned timber and pulp and paper, and I'm curious: is that a major source of threat for orangutans? And if so, is that something that the Orangutan Land Trust is working on as well?
They remain threats, not at the degree of oil palm. Oil palm is in sheer scope is really the pure hectarage is really impactful. The pulp and paper tends to focus in an area of Sumatra that orangutans are not found, and the oil palm tends to focus in Kalimantan and Borneo and Sabah and Sarawak, in these lowland often the peat swamp forest, which is not good for, peat is not good for oil palm. They don't grow very well, but it comes cheap and people plant it there. But these lowland diptera carp forests, it's like the prime location to plant, and it happens to be the prime habitat for orangutans. So this intersection. So it's the intersection of the commodity with that. Mining is also a problem. And at least equal, if not more, depending on what scientists you speak to, is direct hunting. The hunting and killing of orangutans unrelated to human-wildlife conflict. And people actually going out and hunting, whether to eat or just, it's a problem that very few organizations are addressing. We recognize it's a huge problem. We don't have the resources to, if we got major funding from somebody, yeah, we could maybe direct some resources to addressing that. But where we stand right now, our resources are quite expended on this issue of oil palm.
Yeah, for sure. So I think those were all of the questions that I had, but is there anything else that you wish I'd asked or that you'd like to tell listeners?
I would just like to say to listeners, there's great organizations really working on this issue, really supporting conservation in the field and delivering the outcomes to protect wildlife such as the orangutan. That might even include zoos. I don't know how all of your listeners feel about zoos. I know that there could be mixed emotions, but zoos do deliver, good zoos, I should say, do deliver important support and resources for conservation in the field. And a lot of projects can't get by without them. They also provide an avenue for a lot of communication with over 800 million visitors a year going to zoos globally. So I would ask you to support the zoos, your listeners, support zoos and NGOs, organizations that are working on your behalf as a person who loves wildlife, to really put the pieces in place to find the solutions to save these species. I know right now times are tough with the coronavirus crisis. Many people have work. Donations are not as forthcoming as they used to be, and NGOs and these projects are facing real challenges to continue to deliver. And because of coronavirus, the threats, it's another podcast perhaps, the threats to biodiversity and forest, there have been reports, are likely to go up. So our work is more essential than ever.
Yeah, so support conservation NGOs, support good zoos. That's a really great call to action. So thank you so much for speaking with me today. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. I've certainly learned a lot. Hopefully the listeners do too. And have a good evening. I hope it's restful.
Well, thank you. I'm really pleased that you've taken the time to talk to me.